Hello and welcome to the Ukrainian Toronto television. My name is Mark Kaplan and our guest today is Mykola Bieleskov, a brilliant analyst, military analyst, and a senior analyst at Comeback Life, Ukrainian fund which assists Ukrainian armed forces. Mykola, hi, welcome. It's very nice to have you here.
Thanks for the invitation.
So our my first question would be, so we are seeing an increasing amount of articles in the Western media citing American political, military officials and European officials, etc., with this weird messaging, which, if you sum it up, will sound something like, this counteroffensive off schedule, or Ukraine is not moving fast enough, hurry up, etc., etc. And I'm not a military analyst, but even for my ear, this scheduled offensive sounds a little bit off, especially considering the circumstances. So my question would be, do you feel like the public, the officials in the West are somehow disappointed, or is everything is fine and it's just like some media reaction to some losses or some long game or something like that? Like, are we late, or is it just like the informational fluctuations?
Well, again, my impression is the following one. For sure, we saw a number of reports, especially the one based by the CNN, published by the CNN, which relied on some unmanned sources from the Western government, from the US government, that said that Ukrainian counteroffensive is not meeting expectations in terms of schedule, but publicly coverage by media like Wall Street Journal and others, I would say they are quite good in terms of managing expectations. So I would say that we moved past the point where there was this kind of discussion about the tempo of counteroffensive. So people more or less accepted that given the objective situation, given the constraints Ukrainian forces face. So that's the explanation why we see what we've seen in the past month. So I would say that despite the fact that there was some articles, indeed very strange one, despite the fact that some fringe movements, some fringe factions of main parties like in the US, they use these reports to discredit Ukrainian counteroffensive and to argue that, well, Ukrainians tried, it failed, so there is no reason to continue to support Ukraine. Despite these instances, I would say that more or less media coverage managed the task of properly covering ongoing counteroffensive and providing people an explanation why situation evolved the way it evolved and why Ukrainians had to adjust its tactics, having seen a lot of mine hindrances, a lot of minefields played by Russians, and seen this combination of mines, tube and rocket artillery, electronic warfare, attack helicopters. So since it's quite a deadly combination, and if we just move on, it means a lot of losses. And that's why Ukrainians had to adjust its tactics. That's why, as far as I understand, we moved past this point when there was a debate, different arguments provided, whether we're meeting the expectations or not. So more or less, we managed to move past this point, past this stage.
General Zaluzhny had his interview for Washington Post posted recently. Probably, I don't know if you've seen it. And it was like, it felt like he was a little bit irritated by all this talk about how counteroffensive is going. And he talked about Ukraine not having air superiority. Like every offensive operation, like according to Russian doctrine, according to American doctrine, NATO doctrine, you need to have air superiority, although we don't, and we have these constraints. How does it affect how does it affect the counteroffensive? How does it affect the actions in the south right now?
Well, yes, I've seen this article. I would say it's an article, it's not an interview. So some ideas of General Zaluzhny, they use in this article. So during this war, we've seen one classic interview, and it was done by The Economist, where we can see clearly what Zaluzhny is thinking, what his ideas are on this or that matter. It's just an article using some some ideas by General Zaluzhny, and despite the fact that it's not an interview but an article, it has some added value. It has some added value precisely because now we can say that it's General Zaluzhny who is providing this or that idea, because it's a one thing if it's some kind of Mykola Bieleskov saying something, but it's not that authoritative. When Commander-in-Chief of Ukrainian Armed Forces saying the same kind of thing, it carries much bigger authority. So yes, it's one of the prerequisites of modern combined armed warfare operations. And if we look at modern operations since World War II, it's unique offensive in terms of that we need to recover large sources of the territories without having this area superiority, and not like having not only area superiority but also firepower superiority, because we don't have this amount of tube and rocket artillery and munitions for them to suppress Russian artillery in short order of time. That's why it's a unique situation. It's quite good that Zaluzhny, using his authority, is trying to manage expectations proportionate to these capabilities we have, objective constraints we have. And that is precisely the thing that people need to keep in mind. So we are fighting proportionate to the capabilities we have, because people, when they look at the situation, they mostly have textbook examples. So Ukraine has to fight given constraints we have and not by the textbook, because if we fight by the textbook, it means much more losses, and that is the reason why we see the situation this way. So this article is important one. It carries the authority by the General Zaluzhny, but it's not an interview.
Guys, before we go next, I have a little ask. We at Ukrainian Terminal Television are doing our best at producing great content, countering Russian propaganda, inviting great experts such as Mykola Bieleskov and famous journalists. And I love it. And I want as many people as possible to watch it, hear it, process it, react to it. And in order to do that, YouTube has to push our video in algorithms. And for that, we need your likes, your subscriptions, and your comments. And I would ask you to leave them. And also, if you want to be more invested in our success, you can donate us using Buy Me a Coffee or YouTube subscription options. Thank you very much. The way this operation, and probably all operations of Ukraine are doing during this war, are they unprecedented in terms of post-World War II warfare? Such balance of power, such scale, as far as I know, it never happened before with such weapons.
Yeah, situation is unprecedented one. So there is there is a combination of circumstances. On the one hand, we can't stick only to defensive mode, since it's our territories, it's our people, and since we need to continue this positive cycle of accomplishments on the front line, more attention to Ukraine, more aid, and we start from the very beginning, more accomplishments. So there is political objectives, and these political considerations, they drive Ukrainians from switching to defense. We largely stick since autumn of the last year to switching to the offensive mode. And yes, the situation is very unique one, because air superiority, and not only air superiority, but firepower superiority and situational awareness superiority are the requirements for modern offensive operations. And in all these categories, we don't have total superiority. That's why we adjusted our tactics. That's why we don't see these attempts to move maneuver formations. So there was some attempts to move maneuver formations at the very beginning. We saw that there is this deadly combination of mines, artillery, electronic warfare, and attack helicopters, and we adjusted. And the ability to adjust, it's one of the things that help us to endure. So that's also the things that need to be kept in mind. So Ukrainians, we constantly adjusting proportionate to the capabilities of our own and our enemy. And that's why right here, right now, what we see in terms of the operation, it's on the one hand a lot of counter battery fights. So we are trying to destroy as much tube and rocket artillery closer to the front line. And simultaneously, we are trying to target their warehouses, their command and control nodes. We've seen these strikes targeting automobile bridge at Chongar. We've seen strike at a large warehouse at Rykove in temporarily occupied Kherson region. So Ukrainians are trying to exploit advantages of long-range precision firepower and provide arguments like for the US, for the Germany that are still thinking whether or not to provide short-range ballistic or cruise missiles of different range. That's why we've seen some adjustment. That is one of the reasons why I am like cautiously optimistic that Ukrainians tried. We've seen that the tactics, classical tactics, it has disadvantages. That's why we need to adjust. That's why we simultaneously pushing at three directions in the South mainland. So two directions Zaporizhia region, one direction in Donetsk region. We are trying to pin as much Russian forces as possible. We're trying to destroy as much as possible of field artillery, of electronic warfare system, of attack helicopters, and simultaneously to destroy as much rare targets on which front line depend.
You mentioned the capabilities of long range. So we recently have had mixed reports. Not sure, it's not confirmed, far from confirmed, that like Biden administration is closer to making a decision on ATACMs long range missile, like kind of long range ballistic missile. But more importantly, there is discussion on providing the cluster munitions to Ukraine, which has never happened before. I wanted to ask you about like what does it mean, what those cluster munitions are, and how can they change or help Ukraine in this offensive?
Yeah, I got it. Well, let's start from the second part of your question. I mean, about cluster munition. The first thing, it's very controversial in the Western world. I mean, there is this number of conventions related to cluster munitions, and some countries eliminated cluster munitions altogether. Ukraine didn't do it, and Russia didn't do it, and also US didn't do it, but still they stick to this idea that cluster munitions should not be provided, and that is one of the problems. I mean, there is this thinking that arms control is important on its own. Arms control is indeed important, but only when we see more favorable environment, when there is no revisionist states and when there is no this human waves attack employed by revisionist states. So this issue is very controversial, and I understand when Ukrainians are raising this issue, it causes different emotions in Western countries who like these arms control regimes. Originally, we tentatively started to raise this issue at the beginning of December of the last year. So it was obvious at that time that since Russians, they are doing mobilization, since Russian increasing the number of people in ranks, it means that they might switch to this human wave tactics. And we saw them around Bakhmut. And for me, it's quite notable that one of the advisors to the commander-in-chief, General Zaluzhny, who is a former US military man, former general, I don't remember his name and surname, but he said that cluster munitions are necessary to confront human waves tactics, because if we rely on classical high explosive projectiles we are provided of 155 millimeters of 105 millimeters to tube artillery, it's like using like this things against he compared with with small buds. So it's you need a flamethrower against this small buds. So he compares that it's not like logical thing to do to employ high explosive projectiles against human wave tactics, and that's why this general, he promoted cluster munitions. But this scene is still controversial, and I would say it requires some change of perception. So people need to accept that to save high explosive projectiles, to convert them, we need to have these munitions, and the issue that some of these munitions might be preserved and constitute a threat to civilians. It's a secondary importance for Ukrainians. The most important thing is to stop this human waves tactics, to converse as much as possible of high explosive munitions, and that's why we are asking this type of munitions.
What they are, like how do they work? What does it mean? Is it
They contain a lot of subcharges, and these subcharges, these components, they can destroy a lot of humans. I mean, they discharge like balls, small balls, and a lot of small balls, and that's why it's quite deadly against human waves on open plain.
do Russians
That's why
use
it's
it
so important.
against Ukrainian armed forces?
They are using it constantly. So if you look at MLRS systems of Smerch and Uragan type, these are like bigger ones compared with Grad. So these are constantly used against Ukrainians. They contain cluster munitions from the day one of this big war.
Thank you. My next question would be regarding the first one. It's a little bit connected, but in terms of Western assistance, Ukraine relies on it really, really hard. And we are seeing, and if I'm not mistaken, President of Czech Republic talked about it, that a lot of things rely on the results of Ukraine's offensive in the summer. This offensive which is going on right now, and if on its success, a lot of assistance is tied to its success. To what extent is it true? To what extent do you feel that Western partners are worried that if something goes wrong, they will stop assisting Ukraine, they will try to find the ways for Ukraine to make concessions, etc., etc.? Do you see that dynamics, or is there like anything at all like that?
Indeed, stakes are very high. I mean, when you are talking with people from abroad, all they talked like 2-3 months before it's counteroffensive. All we are waiting for you counteroffensive and nothing else. And indeed, it's true. Counteroffensive is very important. Strategically, it's very important, not only to reclaim territories, to liberate people who are under the threat of prosecution. Indeed, it's important because everyone wants to be on the winner's side, not on a loser's side. And even such skeptics like Donald Trump or Ron DeSantis, even for them, if Ukraine is successful, it would be very difficult to argue against aiding Ukraine. And in general, to sustain the cycle of aid, long-term aid, it's very important. And that's why I agree, because otherwise there would be fringe factions. There's already these fringe factions, like if we take US politics, so there is this fringe factions alas in two mainstream parties, and they exploit any hint that Ukraine is not that successful to argue against aiding Ukraine long term. So that's indeed very important. But the major problem is that no matter the results of this counter-offensive, of course, I hope it will be successful. It produce results. But no matter the result, there is this problem that despite the fact that decisions are adopted to start increasing production of like munitions, of equipment, we won't see like major results in the next couple of years. So I just can provide one example, very telling one. So monthly consumption of shells for 155 millimeter tube artillery in Ukraine is 90,000 shells. We need 90,000 shells because we spend 3,000 shells a day. Right here, right now, US managed to increase the amount of shell production in the last 15 months from 14,000 shells to 24,000 shells. Yes, it's a progress, but it's not enough. So the major problem about long-term assistance, if we are talking about specific systems, about equipment, is that there is this lag in production, despite the decisions adopted, and it relates not only to munitions for artillery, it relates to HIMARS munition, it relates to Stinger, Javelin, and other kind of munition. But strategically, I would say that politically, situation changed in Ukrainian favor. And by this, I mean that after 24th of February 2022, people in Western countries, I mean, political establishment, think tankers, media, they understood the importance of Ukrainian security for European security. So right here, right now, it's not only rhetoric when people are saying that without Ukrainian security being guaranteed, it means that there would be instability in Europe. That's why, yes, there is a consensus that Ukrainian security need to be strengthened. Maybe there are disagreement how it should be done. There is Ukrainian position, there is NATO countries' position, different positions. But politically, we did this progress. The only problem is that industrial capacity is lagging, no matter the results of this counteroffensive, and it's a kind of problem because if like Putin and his close circle make conclusions that after Ukrainian counteroffensive we can like rely on human waves precisely rely on human waves. We can try another offensive, and it would be very difficult for Ukraine to confront it because the stock of munition is decreasing and the rate of production is not increasing that much to compensate for the monthly or annual consumption.
Is there though the understanding in the West that the increase of production is necessary for themselves, not only for the war in Ukraine, but for their potential defense against China, which is pretty much okay with increase in production and which is good in it. And correct me if I'm wrong, but what this war proved is that the attrition, wars of attrition are real, and you should rely on a big, large amount of munitions, large amount of weapons, large amount of different systems, etc. Not only for like the last generation fancy stuff.
There is an understanding. There are like contracts provided by USDOD, by other ministries of defense in NATO countries. There are reports by very famous think tank that are precisely warning that given the current rate of production, we won't be able both to compensate what was spent to confront Russia in Ukraine and also to confront China in the Pacific region. But despite the fact that there is understanding, there are already decisions adopted to increase production. There is no magic wand. So there are still classic problems like the shortage of qualified people, the shortage of subcomponents, the shortage of industrial capacity you need to increase. So that's the thing that is facing Western military-industrial complex, and it's not unique. The only thing that compensated that Russian military-industrial complex is facing the same problem. So to say otherwise, that Russians are so successful, it's not that case. For sure they are adjusting, for sure they are smuggling subcomponents, but they are facing the same kind of things, and they are facing the same kind of problem. I mean that land warfare equipment has become more sophisticated. I mean, if we compare like land warfare equipment in World War II, it was not that sophisticated. Now even land warfare equipment is really sophisticated, and that's why its rate of production decreased. That's why you need more of like sophisticated subcomponents to produce final products and so on. But this is the problem the Russians are also facing, so it's not unique to the West.
Okay. By the way, you mentioned about the Western companies, American companies struggling with the production. I've seen the news recently that Raytheon, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it right, had to find the people who are on their retirement already and ask them to come back and train people to produce Stingers, because they lost the qualification of producing Stingers, which showed themselves really, really good in this war.
Yeah, it's very indicative example. So, like at the end of the Cold War, 3 million people work in U.S. military-industrial complex. After all the consolidation, only 1 million people now works, and that's why there is a shortage of workforce, especially qualified workforce, and it's one of the hindrances that is preventing like an increase in the production. So, but the most important thing to keep in mind, so it's not only the West that is facing this problem, but Russia is also facing the same kind of problem. So all of the countries, with maybe exception of China, after the end of the Cold War, they decreased the amount of workforce that is dedicated to military-industrial complex. There was a lot of consolidation. There is a lot of, I would say, the industrialization in military-industrial complex, because the demand was not that great compared with the Cold War. That's why situation is not unique.
Nobody planned. It feels like even Russian didn't plan that much that they will be in such a war.
For this kind of war, yes, 16 months of high-intensity war with this huge consumption of resources and materials. Yes, Russians also planned for a very short war on their borders and didn't think about mobilization capacity of their military-industrial complex.
My last question would be: there's growing concern in the West. Oh, well, okay, it was from the beginning regarding the nuclear escalation. We call it nuclear blackmail because it doesn't change much apart from the lack of the West providing Ukraine with such capabilities as ATACMs, HIMARS, F-16s, etc., etc. Recently, we had these breakdowns with the F-16s. We had these breakthroughs, with Storm Shadows, with long-range missiles, and did something change? Is nuclear blackmail not working that good anymore, or what have changed?
Well, situation to some extent it changed. If we especially talk about some specific military capability, indeed, as we see, Biden administration is making conclusions that Russians are not going to follow their blackmail if another capability is provided. I mean, military capability is provided. But in terms of if we are talking about Ukrainian NATO integration, alas, it's still working. I mean, nobody wants to admit Ukraine into NATO because, as Biden said, I don't want to have World War III. I mean, right here, right now, everyone agrees that after this war ends, after rate of hostilities intensity decrease, then we can talk about Ukrainian NATO membership. But in the course of the war, for Biden himself, for some of his advisors, it's a non-starter, precisely because there is nuclear weapons. And that's why we can say that there is some progress, but it more concerns specific military capability. But when we talk about NATO, Ukrainian integration, is still nuclear blackmail works. But there is other side of the coin. I mean, Russian side. And it's quite interesting developing their so-called expert discussion. Why I say this way? Because these people are propagandists and not experts. They're not sticking to the ethic code, but still, there was a peak of different articles related to hypothetical unconventional escalation employed during June of this year. And it's quite notable because for Russian experts, it's very difficult to admit, to reconcile with the fact that nuclear blackmail didn't work the way they wanted to work. So despite all controversies, different assessments, including done by myself, but still Biden administration, they managed to simultaneously provide Ukraine with more and more sophisticated capability, and at the same time pass the buck of the responsibility for breaching nuclear taboo on Russia. And it's very unique because when this war broke out, big war broke out, there was no Cold War lessons to rely on. So Biden administration did it in a process, and they did it quite successfully, and that's why the Russians are very rattled. They really talking about that US is so successful and fighting this approach that Russia indeed can get this strategic defeat. That's why they are trying to scare US from aiding Ukraine with another bunch of articles. But it's desperation. As for me, I'm 100% sure that it won't work, and then Russians will face the situation. So they either indeed would follow their threats, and we can discuss quite a lot. It's an interesting topic about escalation management, all the details.
We don't want. I don't want this.
Or they have to make a step back, and by this to demonstrate that all their threats, they are baseless. That's why the situation is quite good for Ukraine, for the US, and Russia is very desperate. Their experts are desperate because their bets on nuclear weaponry it failed. So they didn't produce results they wanted to see.
Thank you. We'll hope it will be there will be openings. Thank you very much, Mykola. Thank you for your time. It was a pleasure to have you and to talk to you, to a real military expert. We don't have them much in our show. Thank you very much.
Thanks for an invitation. Always pleasure to talk with you.
Have a good day and bye.